Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the wonders of modern science, we can now reveal to the world the face of the ancient Britons. So you've probably already seen this story in the news. Ahead of an upcoming documentary for the UK's Channel 4, researchers released images of a facial reconstruction for the ancient human remains known as Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man is a roughly 10,000-year-old skeleton found in a cave in Somerset in England at the start of the 20th century. It dates back to a time when the ice sheets had receded from much of Europe. Britain and Ireland were still attached to continental Europe, and groups of people were slowly migrating into the still new land. Researchers have extracted DNA from the remains, and from that have been able to determine a number of things about who the Cheddar Man was. Fascinating though it is, ordinarily such a story wouldn't really get the sort of reach that this one has had in news media and elsewhere. What's made this story stand out is just how dark-skinned the reconstructed face of Cheddar Man has been portrayed. This, along with statements in the media, effectively saying this research redefines what it means to be British or European, has not surprisingly stirred controversy.
They're calling him Cheddar Man.
Why Cheddar Man?
I don't understand that part. I've been looking and I'm not sure.
Now, 10,000 years ago, Britons would have been black, according to groundbreaking genome analysis.
For those of us who identify as being white British, it's now reasonable to ask, well, what does that actually mean?
There are reasons to be skeptical about this story, both about the announced findings and even more so the way the findings are being used to advance a particular narrative about our own time. First of all, it's worth noting that the researchers held off publishing their full findings and instead waited till after the broadcast of the accompanying documentary. Nonetheless, the conclusion seems to be that Cheddar Man was a Western hunter-gatherer, a group of people who lived in Europe after the last ice age, who it's reasonably believed had darker skin than the modern-day European. This is supposed on the basis that genetic information obtained from Western hunter-gatherer fossils indicates that they lacked a couple of genes almost universally possessed by modern Europeans, that are linked to decreased skin pigmentation. However, skin and hair pigment are known to be products of a number of genes interacting with one another, rather than just single isolated genes. The absence of these genes by itself might not be an indication that Western hunter-gatherers were dark-skinned. For instance, East Asians also lack the aforementioned genes, yet still have a somewhat light skin pigment. Certainly based on the demands of the climate and environment, for example decreased sunlight and therefore decreased availability of vitamin D, it's reasonable to presume Cheddar Man and his relatives might not have survived very long if they had skin as dark as the reconstruction portrays. Early refutations of some of the data so far released also seems to suggest a skin tone near olive or brown might have been more accurate. Further, very dark skin, as one finds in Nigeria and Sudan for instance, is associated with an additional gene that increases eumelanin production in such populations' skin. As yet, there has been no mention of this gene in relation to Cheddar Man or Western hunter-gatherers. Some recent studies have suggested very fair skin may be an adaptation that arose in Europeans as recent as the Neolithic period. The theory goes that a switch from a hunter-gatherer diet, heavy in oily fish, to an agricultural Neolithic diet probably resulted in people receiving less dietary vitamin D. This would have created a selection pressure for fairer skin, which would more readily absorb vitamin D from sunlight. There are caveats that I could add here, but I'll avoid those so as not to get too bogged down in what is ultimately a side issue. If accurate, all this speaks to is the relative rapidity with which our European ancestors adapted to the environment of the time, and became something that would resemble an ethnic European of our present time. In light of this, it's not surprising that Cheddar Man might not have looked, for instance, like a stereotypical modern Scandinavian. Later migrations from the east of the continent, in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, saw massive upheavals to Europe's population, as groups of fair-skinned people, tens of thousands of years removed genetically from Cheddar Man and his people, all but replaced them. It's these later migrations that modern Europeans are primarily descended from. The next thing to note is that despite the likelihood of his skin being darker than modern Europeans, Cheddar Man was neither African nor black in the sense that most people use the term, i.e. basically to mean sub-Saharan African, although sometimes the term is used to describe Australian Aborigines as well. This is contrary to statements made in the Natural History Museum's initial press release that might lead one to think he was African, but I'll get to that in a moment. Cheddar Man is approximately 10,000 years old. The ancestors of both Europeans and Asians diverged from Africans about 60,000 years ago, whilst Europeans diverged again from East Asians about 40,000 years ago. Also, in any meaningful sense, the only living peoples with any notable genetic similarity to Western hunter-gatherers are European. And just to further the point that modern Europeans are not in any notable way descended from Africans, after diverging from them 60,000 years ago, the following map shows the amount of admixture from Africa in modern European populations. As you can see, it's effectively negligible, below 0.5% for instance in the British Isles, where Cheddar Man was found. This leads me quite neatly to the core point of this video. For as interesting as the science is, the real heart of this story is how it has been used to advance a particular political narrative about our present day, relating to mass immigration and multiculturalism, and to dishonestly deconstruct the identity of Europeans. It's probably not surprising to see this from low-T bugmen news outlets like Salon.com or the Young Turks.
When they tested his DNA, surprise! He ain't white. He don't look like modern Britons. If you're a racist, you might not be much of a fan of science. This irritates the racists because they hate the idea that some of their DNA might actually come from black or brown people.
But this narrative has also been picked up by state-funded news outlets like the BBC. Even more unfortunately, the same line has arguably been advanced by some of the scientists involved with the initial project. Here in the original press release for the Natural History Museum, Cheddar Man is misleadingly described as having markers for skin pigmentation associated with sub-Saharan Africa, whilst also described basically as typical of the European population of the time. As we've already seen, this first point is not accurate, but it has formed a cornerstone of the narrative about Cheddar Man advanced by various news media organisations. It's perhaps worth bearing in mind that this press release wasn't written by a researcher or geneticist from the Cheddar Man project, but was written by a digital content manager with a background in marketing and communication, so the description could quite easily just be a mistake. One thing we've been told by the press is that Cheddar Man was the first Briton, and that the first Britons were, by implication, black African immigrants. Conveniently, this overlooks that Cheddar Man is not even the earliest example of a fossilised human in Britain. His may be the oldest, nearly complete human skeleton in the British Isles, but there are in fact a number of much older, less complete human remains that have been found, such as the so-called Red Lady of Paviland, which is 34,000 years old, and remains that were found in the same location as Cheddar Man that date back 4,000 years earlier than him. So assertions such as this by the Express are, in this sense at least, false. Also dubious are these from Sky News and The Independent that assert Cheddar Man was a modern Briton, without offering a particularly convincing qualification of what exactly makes one a modern Briton. But the narrative that's being pushed relies on this impression that the nations of the British Isles were founded by non-white people, that the perceived Britishness or Irishness, etc., of the people who until a few decades ago were regarded as its indigenous inhabitants is nothing but a flimsy falsehood clung to by racists and remnants of a brutal colonial era. Along with this have been opinion pieces that have chided so-called white supremacists, whose entire sense of whiteness is now, they claim, undermined, and pieces from non-white people whose ancestors emigrated to Europe less than a century ago that tell us how much more welcome and a part of things they now feel after seeing Cheddar Man's swarthy visage. Part of this is a naive conflation of skin colour with race, which is excessively simplistic, especially when looking at ancient populations.
There is no one way that an English person looks. There's no one way that a British person looks. I am British. I look British. As a geneticist, Cheddar Man, it explodes a lot of myths, and it draws on evidence of our origins, which are in Africa, which are inherently incredibly diverse, which are deeply linked to migration from all parts of the world. So, you could be looking at a person who looks completely white, but whose ancestry is 90% African, knowing that the genetic analysis has gone into informing what he actually looked like. It does make me feel more comfortable as a brown Briton, because all my life I've heard the idea that to be British means to be white, that I can't call myself English even though I was born here.
The ultimate conclusion one is supposed to draw from all of this is that effectively, Britain and Ireland and Europe more generally have always been multicultural. There have always been brown people here, i.e. there have always been Africans and South Asians and so on in Europe. Indeed, these people were here before white people. Therefore, the modern equivalents of such people have as much right, if not more, to be in Europe as anybody who sees themselves as white European, which by the way is just a social construct, of course. This narrative is a not so subtle accompaniment to the mass immigration to the West that I've discussed in other videos, and is obviously intended to justify and disarm European people's opposition to it by undermining their sense of distinctness and sense of belonging to a place and culture. None of which, by the way, is meant to imply a grand conspiracy on behalf of the media or the researchers, but is an indictment of the morals and values that have taken seed in our culture. It is also a criticism of the nakedly political editorial policies of major broadcasters and news outlets that are committed to the notion that diversity is a strength, multiculturalism is a self-evident good, and the determination that any notions of identity or homogeneity among European peoples must be undermined, for fear that they will lead to another genocide or imperial order being enforced upon non-white people. All of this may seem quite absurd and a bit difficult to take in, particularly if you're not used to looking critically at the worldview that many of us have absorbed through mass media, academia and so on. So I'd like to take a look at a piece of media that I feel illustrates nearly all of what I'm saying here. Here's a discussion from Channel 4 News that followed on from a report about Cheddar Man.
To see Cheddar Man with his dark skin, it definitely provoked quite an emotional response in me, and I think that's the power of this. It's one thing to know that there were black people here thousands of years ago and to know that white people weren't always white, but to see...
There weren't just black people. There's no evidence that there were white people.
No, but we know that there were Africans here before there were English people here, for example. And so through that gives you a sense of the idea that there's this indigenous British person who is white and essentially British is a fiction, you know, it's a narrative that was created over time. It's not based on scientific facts.
Does this make a mockery of the whole idea of race?
In terms of the idea that race is a social construct, yeah, it absolutely does. Because if your idea is that the way that you look is the way that you are, if that your body and your physical appearance code for things beyond that physical appearance, things like your behavior and your character, then it certainly does.
But the second thing is immigration. We do not have a sense of being an immigrant nation, even though that is essentially what we are. And I think this is very useful in reminding people that we are an immigrant nation.
It's true to say that simplistic narratives don't work in the context of population genetics or the study of ancient peoples. But this does not mean we should shrug our shoulders and uncritically accept fashionable platitudes about diversity. To state that race is a social construct in the middle of a discussion about genetic discoveries is simply a genuflection to the political zeitgeist. And we must not forget that multiculturalism is itself a simplistic narrative, propped up against strawman arguments of white supremacy and racial purity, which no one really believes in. To be fair to the documentary itself, it does have moments where it clarifies one or two things that have been misconstrued in the media hype. But it still parts a simplistic, multicultural narrative about our present time right from the very start of the film.
There's been a lot of talk lately about Britain, about who belongs and who doesn't. Now, science is about to reveal the truth about where we come from and who we really are.
It may be that we have to rethink some of our notions of what it is to be British.
This is the great thing about working in this field. The historical perspective that you get just tells you that things change, things are in flux, and what may seem as cemented truth that people that feel British should have white skin through time is not at all something that is an unmutable truth. It has always changed and it will change.
The idea that any of what has been found out about Cheddar Man or the prehistoric populations of Europe more generally invalidates the concept of race or the sense of identity held by Europeans is absurd. If anything, the fact that we are able to analyze even the DNA of long dead individuals, document their traits, and place them within a context of other populations reinforces the idea of biological heredity at a level even finer than the commonly understood broad racial categories. If we should draw any political lessons from the tale of Cheddar Man, perhaps it's that the power of migration to rewrite the ethnic and cultural landscape of a place is immense. Migration brings with it population upheavals, and whilst it is by no means a constant throughout history, it has been the catalyst for massive historic turning points. Much of the science on population genetics that things like this story rely on is still quite new, and conclusions are being rewritten all the time. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd recommend checking out some of the videos on Survive the Jive's channel. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Thanks for watching.